thank you for joining us for another episode of God, Law, and Liberty with David Fowler, President of the Family Action Council of Tennessee. Every week, we are putting culture, politics, and law on a collision course with the truth of God's Word. And now, here's David.
Thank you for joining me for God, Law, and Liberty today. And I really am delighted and honored to have you with me. And for those of you who are such faithful listeners, I thank you so very much. I will confess that there's been so much going through my mind about the briefs that were filed by Christians and the legal arguments being made by Christians in the Tennessee transgender case that I've been talking about that's in front of the Supreme Court. That really trouble me, and my thoughts go in 100 different directions, I guess you could say, and I feel like I could just start talking extemporaneously and go on for hours, and it'd probably be a jumbled mess and not much help. But I thought today I would slow down just a bit, and not pursue a further discussion of what Blackstone called natural liberties, civil liberties, and political liberties. We just finished elections, and of course people are talking about, civil rights, civil liberties, and they really don't even know historically what those terms mean and the difference between them. And let me just suggest to you, if you ever run into somebody's talking about civil rights, just say, well, what are civil rights? And where do they come from? And if they give you an answer, say, so how are those different from political rights? And then depending on what they say, so how are any of those different from natural rights or natural liberties? You may not have to know the answers to the questions. Just asking them simply will let them know they don't really know what they're talking about. And you can always just say, that's interesting. Thanks. And walk off. But anyway, see, here I go kind of rambling. So what I wanted to do today is I want to first make an offer that I hope you can't refuse, that I think will give you a little better understanding of what I covered last week. You may recall, if you listened to that episode, that I talked about law professor Philip Johnson's article that was in First Things. I don't think I mentioned where I found it, but it's called Nihilism and the End of Law. And I mentioned that article and a couple of points in it in the context of law professor Arthur Leff's Law Review article from 1979, calling out folks who talk about rights without any consideration of duties that really provide the moral foundation for the rights. And you may recall that I mentioned that seemed to be the kind of argument, a rights-only kind of argument that Alliance Defending Freedom was making in support of the Tennessee law. Now, look, I don't mention that to denigrate anybody. But within the church, we need to be able to speak the truth in love for the purpose of getting to the truth that we might grow. And if we don't know what we're doing and who's doing what, then one or more of us will be taken captive by the other. So I'm just telling you what I think I'm seeing for the purpose of hopefully us growing as a body of Christ and refining our understanding of what law is and doing it better than we've been doing it, because we've obviously lost a lot of ground in the law. So my offer is this. I wrote a short monograph. I didn't think about it last week, that shows the difference. It's short. It's 20 pages, 5 by 7 pages. It's not long. That it shows the difference between how my friend Jeff Schaefer presented legislative testimony in support of a bill addressed to embodied human meaning and purpose. I mean, that's what we've been talking about. That's what we're talking about in the context of this transgender legislation. And how an ADF lawyer argued in support of a bill on women's sports that should also depend on human meaning and purpose. But the two kinds of arguments are completely different. And that's why I titled the monograph Toward Christian Nihilism, a concise look at two different policy approaches. So if you'd like a PDF of that little monograph to read to help better understand last week's podcast, maybe this week's podcast, well, then just send an email to me at senatorfowler94@gmail.com. And I think, given that it's testimony in connection with legislation, it'll give you a real live experience of what I'm talking about, so that it doesn't appear to be just abstract or theological or philosophical. It's real world stuff taking place in real world context, apart from just in courtrooms, in the legislature. So you can wind up supporting a bill that's actually advocating an unbiblical understanding of the cosmos. So when I was asked if I was going to come testify, join my testimony to that bill and the way it was being presented and argued and the way it was drafted, I said no, because I'm not interested in saving women's sports. I'm interested in saving women as a category of kinds of human beings, and not just who can get awards and trophies and scholarships, you see. So send an email, like I said, to senatorfowler94@gmail.com. And second, and related to that email address, if you access this podcast through the website for the Family Action Council of Tennessee, or through the link to it, and it's Friday email, 5 Minutes for Families, remember, you're not going to find it there. And you may not find it anywhere else after December 31st, other than through the Fight, Laugh, Feast podcast network. That's the Fight, Laugh, Feast network. I'm working on whether I'll put it on other platforms, but that's where you will find it. You may not find it in other places. So if you're not sure you can find it, then send a link to me again at senatorfowler94@gmail.com, and I'll send you a link to the podcast starting in January, but that's where you'll find it. Anyway, after thinking about the last couple of podcasts, I thought, what questions might I have if I were listening to some of this stuff for the first time? And, sometimes you don't even know what questions you should be asking because the material may be so new, the response to it or the objection to it or the counter to it might not even come to your mind. So I thought today what I'm going to do is cover two questions that I would ask against myself or things I've said, and then try to answer them. So what I'm going to do is, at the very beginning here, I'm going to give you the two questions. In case one of them you're not interested in listening, well, you scroll through the podcast to the one you are interested in listening to. But here's the first question I would ask in light of some of the things that I've been saying. If history is meaningless within the cosmological framing that we're living under, which is a nihilistic cosmos, then why do you speak incessantly about common law, and particularly the old common law? Why wouldn't we go with the kind of argument that ADF made, that Tennessee's transgender law, quote, satisfies this court's modern equal protection jurisprudence? Why would we cite these old cases, David? Why would we be going all the way back to Justinian's code in the 6th century if history is meaningless? And that's a great question. And the second question is, why would I make this statement in last week's podcast? And here it is. Do you see? Claiming rights without expressing what the moral duty is that pertains to the right. And that's not law. That's not a Christian view of law. That's not a Christian view of anything. So why would I say that there's nothing really Christian about a rights-based argument in defense of a law that would punish doctors for sterilizing a minor to being treated for gender dysphoria? Isn't that a Christian thing to do? Why I say this isn't a Christian view of anything. So those are the two questions I want to try to tackle today. And so let's pick up with why asserting common law in a culture that considers history meaningless a good idea. And the first answer and foremost answer is because we are in a court of law and not at a history symposium. And no judge can deny the relevance of common law or its relevance to the Constitution. Even Justice Jackson Brown, I went back and listened a little bit to her confirmation hearings, and she spoke of the Constitution as being interpreted in terms of our legal history and traditions. So, who may be the most liberal justice on the court currently, says, yes, in terms of law, that legal history and tradition is important. And since common law is part of our legal history and traditions, using it as law is a legal argument. It's not a philosophical one, such as philosophers about history might have about the meaning of history, which, in my view, is what made the EPPC's brief problematic, because it was arguing philosophies in history unrelated to actually really a legal argument. Now, they were trying to talk about human nature, but it wasn't an argument rooted in law. And that's where I would say, well, great. Who cares what Aristotle or Plato thought? They weren't making legal decisions, right? That's fine. Go argue that in the history department at a history symposium. But don't come in here to the Supreme Court and a court of law trying to decide a legal issue with that. That's just the way I'd look at it. But anyway, so what I'm saying is that legal history is just as relevant to a constitutional interpretation today as the court's modern equal protection jurisprudence. Unless, and this is the big thing, unless one believes in a living constitution, which is the only reason I can think of why only current precedents that weren't overruled earlier or didn't overrule earlier precedents would be considered. So if there's a case from 1879, after adoption of the 14th Amendment in particular, that's never been reversed, and it says this is how to interpret the law, well, why would we only look at the modern version? Make the court overrule the old version. Put the two in conflict. Make them reconsider whether the modern version is actually the correct legal version. Don't just capitulate until you've made the argument and lost. And to disregard those still extant, still pertinent, still valid decisions and just ignore them is essentially, to me, to say I'm going with the living constitution approach. Only the most current decisions are important. And so anyway, as a matter of law, in a court of law, the history of law and the common law is not irrelevant. As the Supreme Court has said on multiple occasions, the Constitution must be interpreted in light of the common law and its history. So, in this context, history is important. In the history symposium, to draw from what happened any meaning or value, well, maybe, that's debatable, right? We don't think so, because it's all God's providence, and God's constantly revealing himself in his works, and all those who have pleasure in his works, it says in the Psalms, study them. But anyway, I think you get my drift. This is why common law, this older common law, is still important. And the fact is, the court, like in the Dobbs case, went back through several hundred years of the history of the law regarding abortion and stuff. So that's why I mention it. Now, as to this question of why positing arguments for rights divorced from or not corresponding to any kind of duty is not a Christian anything, I want to introduce it with a clip from Choc Knox Unplugged. And the clip begins with David Shannon, Choc Knox, asking a question about theocracy. and why it seems so problematic even for many Christians. And Jason's response is the key to what I want you to hear, but it's important to hear it in this context. Because it really, what he says is the key to the problem with asserting only rights vis-a-vis the historical, and I submit biblical approach of always connecting duties and rights, which is the point I tried to make last week, if you recall, in my use of Arthur Leff's Law Review article and the quotes from Blackstone. In case you didn't listen, and I'm sure you probably aren't looking back at notes like in a classroom setting, but Blackstone says, the rights of persons that are commanded to be observed by law are such as are due from every citizen, which are usually called civil duties. And he acknowledged that the, quote, more popular way is to speak of rights as that which belong to a person, not in terms of the duties owed by a person, but the point's the same, that rights arise out of duty. And remember Leff noting that some legal scholar, I don't remember his name right now, had begun his book with the assertion that people had rights. And he said, well, why didn't we start the book with the claim people have duties? So rights and duties are the flip side of the same coin. So with that, let's listen to this clip from Knox Unplugged.
So when I see people arguing against a theocracy or they're mad about religious people pushing their beliefs on folks, I'm like, so who do you want pushing your beliefs on you, right? Like what system, let me know what it is, the system that you want to push your beliefs on somebody. Like, what is that system? Because it's going to happen. Somebody's beliefs are going to get pushed on you. Somebody's moral values are going to be at the forefront. So we're not questioning whether or not we should have a moral value system. We're questioning where should it come from, right? And so I guess I want to understand when people are afraid or concerned about a theocracy, what is it that what is it they're concerned about? Because they're not concerned about power and authority. They're concerned about whose.
But they are concerned about authority, right? Because authority is not a real thing in the modern system or in the modern mind. Authority has to do with power and coercion, not with right to rule. Not because there's not a belief in hierarchy.
Wait, you got to say that again, because I think that authority is not about power.
Because authority, when we say authority, we immediately think that it has to. That's the power make other people do what they don't want to do. Right. That's what authority is.
Yeah.
That it's coercive force, but authority, and scripturally speaking, has to do with the authority is established first when Adam is given dominion over the world, and so that he can garden it and bring it to its intended end.
Now, I admit it took a little while for all that to sink in for me, and I've listened to this episode multiple times. I would encourage you to catch it. I don't remember exactly what the date of it was, but Nietzsche is in the title to it. And here's how I might explain it: that hierarchy is a part of a biblical cosmology. Cosmology being simply a concise way of describing that discipline or branch of learning or science that considers what kind of place we think this is and how we think it works. So obliterating or trying to obliterate hierarchy or ignoring it, as pure democracy does, it both ignores it and tries to obliterate it. It's actually to try to work things in this world contrary to the way God designed it to work. And that ends in death. It just won't work. It kills the order in a home, in a church, in a business, in civil government, and it kills law itself. Because the very nature of law, for it to be objectively real, is a dependency on a God-given and God-ordained hierarchy being woven into the fabric of the cosmos and its operation. Now, it's not just hierarchy per se, because evolution has a hierarchy, right? I mean, that's why in Dred Scott they said the slaves and their descendants were an inferior subordinate class of beings on this long chain of being from amoeba to the white man, let's say, right? So what evolution is, what we have done is we've perverted the notion of hierarchy wherever we've tried to use it, and we've tried to obliterate it through concepts like democracy. But notice what Jason is saying, that this idea of hierarchy started with Adam, and so the story in Genesis 1 and 2 is not just about how material stuff came into being or what process it came into being. It's telling us that God delegated to Adam not just a power, but an authority or an office, which you may recall he coined as the gardener, which actually parallels who Mary thought she saw in the garden when Jesus was raised from the dead. She said, I thought you were the gardener, right? So the resurrection of Jesus is the garden story starting over again, and his ministry started in the wilderness, and it winds up in a garden, starting over again as the last Adam and the second man. So, but with God, in his delegation, this right to exercise dominion, it came with duties. He was to guard and to tend the garden. He was to bring it to its intended end. He was to subdue what was outside the garden. And God made the world in such a way that to keep the garden and to grow the garden and to subdue the rest of the world, there were laws to which Adam had to submit if he was going to exercise well his rights and fulfill his duties. So see, woven into God's hierarchy are rights and duties and boundaries. So right there in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, God's word comes against any conception of rights independent of duties. And remember the story of the centurion. He said, I have a right to tell people to do this and do that and go here and go there because he was under an authority. But he obviously couldn't tell them to do something that he had no authority to tell them to do. I used to work in the estate planning area, and I could give you a limited power of attorney that says you have the right to handle all my banking transactions, but you have no right to sell any of my real estate, right? So there were rights, there were duties. You have the right to handle this, but you have a duty not to handle the other, okay? And what the world wants is rights without duties, which is another way of saying we want to be like God. And when in our legal arguments we can't find a duty to which an asserted right is attached, then I would submit that we're not making an argument that accords with how God made the world. So with what Jason said and what I've just said in further explanation of it, that I hope is helpful, let's revisit the comment from my friend that I mentioned in the last episode, the lawyer who works for another legal organization, who said to me, well, isn't it a good thing if the argument works and some children are saved from sterilization? What would you say in response to that if you now understand the argument itself is affirming a world of rights without duties? Would you say that's a good thing? Would you not say maybe with me that, well, we're actually doing what Jason described? We're asserting only a right to wield power, and we're acting more like Machiavellians than Christians. Let me put my question or my retort to my friend's observation. Let me put it a different way. Is God honored and glorified by an argument that in its essence denies the truth about the way God intended his cosmos to work? At least to me, not in my way of understanding what it means for us to image God into the world. Because if we give the wrong image of God, it will come out in very wrong ways. And I think, given the nihilistic cosmology in which we're living, The world thinks of God, as Oliver Wendell Holmes described him in relation to real common law, as just a brooding omniscience in the sky. And that's why I think, as Jason said, Christians come across as nothing but tyrants, pointing to some invisible God that Kantian thinking has now convinced us that really can't be known in the way we know other things about nature, and is therefore unknowable. So, that's just going to foment hatred against this brooding omniscience in the sky and make us look like we're just playing a power game and using some invisible God that nobody can know and nobody can argue as to his propositions. Are they right or wrong? And as I mentioned earlier, the world thinks in an evolutionary chain of being sort of way. That there are some people naturally on the top, and some are naturally born on the bottoms, and the ones on top rule, and the ones on the bottom get ruled, and they have no rights. And there's just constant rivalry between where you are on this chain, and everybody's seeking to climb up higher and push somebody else down. And that's how they see the world, and we just drag God in to justify raising ourselves up and putting them down. But the biblical cosmology of God-given and God-ordained hierarchies entails authority, but within jurisdictional bounds, and with accountability to God for operating rightly within those bounds, or for operating wrongly outside those bounds. And there's a corresponding liberty protected by those boundaries and by that accountability. So there's authority and there's submission, but it's within bounds that God has established and God holds people accountable to. And so that's a whole different understanding from the way the world looks at it, and it's not just a rights-only kind of claiming argument. In fact, the kind of world that God created kind of goes out the window if we conform our thinking to a rights-asserting, power-based cosmology. And that's why I said this kind of line of argumentation is not a Christian anything, because it's rooted in an unbiblical and therefore not Christian understanding of the cosmos itself. So I think I'm going to end there today, but let me remind you, if you would like to read the little monograph, Toward Christian Nihilism, see what a biblical cosmology produces in terms of argument versus the kind of testimony that's produced by a nihilistic worldview, then send me an email to senatorfowler94@gmail.com. And I hope you'll join me again next week for the next episode of God, Law, and Liberty.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to help spread the word, please give us a 5-star review and tell your friends to subscribe too. God, Law, and Liberty is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts. For more information, please visit us at www.facttennessee.org. That's factennessee.org. And please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Fact Tennessee.